You're looking at
It's going to be self-organizing.
me? Oh, I thought we would have one. Okay. Let's do just a presentation round very quickly. I am Lotta Moberg. I research special economic zones. I'm involved with refugee cities that has the idea of implementing special economic zones at refugee camps. I'm also involved with Politas, a consulting firm that seeks to implement special economic zones. I'll be talking tomorrow. I have a book called Political Economy of Special Economic Zones. So anything political economy related on special economic zones is very much my field.
My name is Marc Joffe. I used to be in the financial industry. I worked as a senior director at Moody's Analytics. Became very interested in bond analysis in the public sector and started doing independent research on that. In 2016, the Niskanen Center at George Mason University in this building published my study, The Origins of Puerto Rico's Fiscal Crisis. And now I work at the Reason Foundation, where I work on pension and privatization issues. I've just had 2 blog posts recently at reason.org, one on immigration policy, which I'll be talking about, and one on the challenges of privatizing the Electrical Authority, PREPA.
So I'm Michael Strong. About 15 years ago, I met John Mackey, CEO of Whole Foods. He and I wanted to create an organization to promote entrepreneurial solutions to world problems, microfinance, social entrepreneurship, tech entrepreneurship, changing the world, yada, yada, yada. I met Mark Fraser, and I haven't seen him here, but Mark Fraser had been in the free zone industry for decades. And Mark persuaded me that zones could create global prosperity. And I drank the Kool-Aid long and deeply, and I got deeply involved and have worked on this zones around the world for a long time now. And I'll have a panel, or I'll have a talk separately that goes into that a bit more. But I do believe that this is the most important solution to global poverty there is.
Hi, I'm Sam Hammond. I work at the Niskanen Center, which is a DC libertarian think tank. Prior to that, I did work at Mercatus as well with Adam Thurier. Doing research on a concept we call innovation arbitrage, which is sort of inspired by an old essay by Mark Andreessen called Drone. Instead of a Silicon Valley, we should have drone valleys or X valleys for all kinds of different emerging technologies around the country to revitalize distressed communities. Now I work on welfare policy for the whole country, but continue to have an interest in innovation arbitrage and things like that.
So maybe we can start with just discussing, we talk about zones as this concept that it's going to solve these problems. What is actually the benefit of having zones versus are we actually just talking about improving regulations, institutions, and things like that? When does it actually make sense to talk about a zone? And particularly we're here to think about and talk about Puerto Rico, and I think it's an especially interesting case because some people here, I hear different languages about around Puerto Rico. Some people talk about it as a country, and they're saying Puerto Rico should have zones, and we know that that's happening already, it's happened in the past. Some people talk about Puerto Rico's past as Puerto Rico being a zone, and I think it's an interesting kind of case where we can juxtapose zone versus the economy as a whole. What in the zone concept is actually beneficial that might not be beneficial in terms of taking the approach of we should just improve things overall? Why do we need the geographical space if that's what we're aiming for? And when is that more beneficial than trying to solve a problem in the economy as a whole?
So I'll go with Bob Haywood's answer. Bob Haywood was for many decades the executive director of the World Economic Processing Zones Association, and he described zones as a way to get around Douglas North's kind of public choice issue where elites in most countries prevent other entities from providing entrepreneurial and business solutions. So that there's this crony capitalist thing that governs most countries, and if you try to change things across the whole jurisdiction, they'll fight you, but if you're in a zone, you're more likely to be able to have greater freedoms than you can across the whole, in this case, territory. So I think one possible answer is that we might be able to get greater legal and regulatory freedoms within a zone than we are across the whole territory of Puerto Rico.
And that would imply that zones are always the second best kind of solution? It's because we can't get what we really want?
Exactly.
Well, I thought maybe it would be helpful if I gave a little historical perspective, since that's what I studied when I wrote the paper. Puerto Rico was invaded and taken over by the United States in 1898. It was the same year that Hawaii became part of the United States. But it's very interesting that Hawaii went on a trajectory towards statehood. In 1959, Hawaii became a state, but Puerto Rico never did. And when you look back at the history, you find that there are, frankly, some pretty racist aspects to that. Maybe you could say, maybe not so racist as just cultural hegemony. But in Hawaii, the previously independent country had been settled by Anglo property owners who had the ability to exert political influence in Washington, D.C. But no such thing happened in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico had been a Spanish dependency. We, quote unquote, marched in and took it over, and operated it in a very paternalistic fashion. One thing that a lot of Puerto Ricans cite that I think you might find particularly objectionable is that at first they didn't have citizenship in the United States at all. So from, say, 1900 to 1917, it was very hard for them to travel internationally, because they really didn't have a passport. So then in 1917, they were granted citizenship, but that was just before World War I. So a lot of people have the theory that the only reason that they were given citizenship was that they could be drafted into the army. Now that's not actually empirically justified, but the juxtaposition of those two things looks pretty bad. It wasn't really until the 1952 Constitution that Puerto Ricans had any level of sovereignty over the island, and that's when the current Commonwealth system was formed. But unfortunately, there was a very serious defect in the Commonwealth Constitution. So most states require a balanced budget. You can only borrow for capital purposes. But in Puerto Rico, there have been two very serious leakages to that. So one is Puerto Rico is distinct from states in that it has a lot of publicly owned corporations like PREPA. And PREPA has borrowed $9 billion, which it now can't repay. And there's actually a total of about $30 billion in public corporation debt, and that all circumvented the balanced budget requirement. So that was sort of one leakage. The second thing is there was actually a translation error in the 1952 Constitution, where the word revenue was mistranslated to being basically any money that the government receives. So bond proceeds could be used to balance the budget, and as a result, Puerto Rico did not have the limits on general fund borrowing, which you see in most states, and that really accelerated Puerto Rico towards the fiscal crisis that we had. So while many people date the problem from the sunsetting of federal tax exemptions on corporations, the problem actually goes way, way, way back to the formation of the public corporations, and then this drafting error in the Constitution. So, just rolling forward to today, the chronic problem that Puerto Rico has had and has been exacerbated in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria has been the reduction in population. Puerto Rico's population growth gradually decelerated, and then the absolute population peaked in 2004, and then since then it's been gradually going down. And I invite you to look at my reason.org post. I have a graph showing the historical and projected population. So this year, the Commonwealth Fiscal Plan projects a 6.4% reduction in population due to mostly to people leaving the island in the wake of Hurricane Maria and not coming back. So a lot of our ideas that we've been discussing here around free zones and deregulation and so forth, those can only really be effective if there are people on the island who are economically active and who can take advantage of the political system or the economic systems that we would like to see. So somehow Puerto Rico has to either replace or attract back the lost population. Attracting back, I think, is going to be very difficult because the per capita or average family income in the continental United States is about 2.5 times what it is in Puerto Rico. So once you move here, and Puerto Ricans are citizens and they're free to move anywhere they want in the United States, it becomes very hard to economically justify moving back. And the innovation that's occurred, through the market process over the last few decades is that, in say the 50s or 60s, when you had the famous play West Side Story, Puerto Ricans were in ghettos in the Bronx and the upper part of Manhattan. So it was an unpleasant life. It was snowy. It wasn't like it was in Puerto Rico. It was an alien culture. But now that so many Puerto Ricans have moved here, and many of them live in the Orlando area in Florida, they have a climate that's more familiar, and they have a culture that's more familiar. So it's very hard to imagine once you get into Florida and become comfortable and economically established that you're going to go back. So what's the alternative? The alternative is Puerto Rico needs immigration from other countries. And the way to achieve that is for Puerto Rico to be given the right by the federal government to issue work permits or other kinds of visas that would allow immigrants from Venezuela, Honduras, all countries in Latin America, and so forth, to be able to come to the island and add their economic power to the economy there. So that's really a fundamental thing that we need as a prerequisite for a lot of our work. And I know that here at SSF we're about building rather than arguing. But because Puerto Rico is under a lot of federal influence, there is a public policy dimension to this where we do have to talk to people in Congress and other elected officials and try to get regulatory changes at both the federal level and the Commonwealth level so that we can see some of the reforms that we would like.
Thank you, and thank you for that overview. I would suggest maybe you two both can then address, knowing this context, and maybe assuming that we don't get the regulations from the feds, we can't always trust the feds. The things that you're working on, coming from where you are, what will be solutions in this situation for Puerto Rico?
Going back to the original question about why zones matter, it's the institutions. But I think Puerto Rico has a bit of a cautionary tale for zone-based policy, and I put it like this: basically, not all zones are created equal. And as Marc was saying, Puerto Rico, for most of its history, was a kind of colonial dependency of the United States and was treated very paternalistically. And in some literatures you read, Puerto Rico is cited as one of the earliest special economic zones because of Operation Bootstrap and the special tax subsidies that were offered for manufacturing. But it was done in a way that was cynical and outside and, for lack of a better word, kind of colonial. And for folks like us who think of zones as a source of potential exit or autonomy, Puerto Rico neither had voice nor truly had exit because it was a kind of dependency. And so I just want to put that out there as in this conversation about zones. A lot of times, zone-based policy, especially when you start talking about like the way China does it, it's not really granting autonomy or making autonomous regions. It's sort of, it can vary from being like a way of escaping cronyism to being sort of like the height of cronyism if it's not done right. So I want to put that word of caution out there. The second point I'd like to make is Puerto Rico has, its economy overall, characteristics that are similar to like the periphery of Europe or similar to East Germany before reunification, where they have Puerto Ricans generally compared to the rest of mainland United States has lower labor productivity, lower labor force participation, and my explanation for this, and it applies also to Europe, is we kind of have a one-size-fits-all monetary policy in the United States, and Puerto Rico, the structure of its labor market, it It's sort of like how Greece and Germany need different monetary policies. Puerto Rico, in an ideal world, would be its own country with its own central bank, with its own monetary policy. And when they're trying to stimulate exports, they would do that through exchange rate depreciation, stuff like that, but they can't do that. So the solution in Germany was, when they reunified, and Eastern Germany had much lower labor productivity, was in the 2000s they brought in this system of wage subsidies. And the point of a wage subsidy is if you can't lower interest rates, you kind of have to do it through what's called an internal devaluation, and you do that through lowering labor costs. And that's how you get a so-called competitiveness. And Germany did this with the system of wage subsidies in the 2000s. It revived its manufacturing sector. It helped to reunify the country because low productivity labor in the East was competitive with that in the West. The problem is that the main wage subsidy that we have in the United States is called the Earned Income Tax Credit, and it doesn't apply in Puerto Rico because of their tax exemption. There's been proposals to bring a EITC to Puerto Rico. Marco Rubio has proposed this. I think it'd be a way of also modernizing the EITC for the nation as a whole, to try different ways of subsidizing wages that would both attract labor to the country or to the Commonwealth, bring in more local labor, and also make the economy more competitive given high labor costs.
Also, the World Bank has the Ease of Doing Business Index, which is not a perfect metric, but it's not terrible, and evaluates how difficult it is to do business in various countries around the world. I think the US is still in the top 10, but typically, places like New Zealand, UK, Australia, Denmark are some of the top-ranked countries in the world. Puerto Rico is ranked separately, and it's below Mexico. And if it's hard to do business, if you're a company looking for a location in which to set up operations, or if you're an individual entrepreneur wanting to go someplace, you're not going to go to one of the places in the world that's ranked poorly to do business. So in order to attract both corporate investment as well as individual entrepreneurs, and probably even returning Puerto Ricans, you want to have a much higher quality environment for doing business. So one of the I don't think we can get a nation or across the territory, but I think a zone that had state-of-the-art, world-class, I would say, e-government and business environment would become an appealing jurisdiction. Basically, Cayman Islands had a deliberate approach to improving their business environment, and now they're a global destination for capital. There are different niches that jurisdiction could have, but some kind of let's create a world-class business environment in order to attract capital, entrepreneur, and talent, I think would be a really powerful strategy.
Now, I do want to give a chance to the audience to ask any questions. So let's see if there's any of that coming. Yes, and way in the back there, shout it out.
Sorry that I'm in the back. My question is about economic zones and public policy. Usually for that you need politicians to agree and implement that. And as far as I know, there are no Puerto Rican politicians in the room. And as far as I know, I don't know what kind of conversations are happening back there, nor is the summit over there. How do we get local state politicians on board, and what kind of incentives do they have to provide, or is this all something that the federal government needs to take care of?
Actually, I'd like to partially answer that. I think you're obviously right that we're here, and ultimately we need to be there. I know from talking to Joe that that's the intention. This is an attempt to build support here in the continental U.S. and then take this act on the road, to Puerto Rico. Yeah, but one element I just want to add to the thought process that people at the Startup Societies Foundation might have in thinking about this is there are 78 municipal governments within Puerto Rico. The Commonwealth is subdivided into these 78 governments. We've done working with an open government group called Abre Puerto Rico. We've analyzed the finances of these, and they really vary. Some are in very good shape. The city of Carolina, Bayamón are a couple of very strong ones. But there are a number of municipalities in Puerto Rico that are essentially bankrupt. They just haven't declared bankruptcy. Ponce is an example of that. I think that we would really do well by identifying some of the more distressed municipalities that may only have 20 or 30 or 40,000 residents, and if they're sort of open to the type of thinking that we have, maybe we could work with them to form some kind of enterprise zone within their municipality, or in fact turn the whole municipality into an enterprise zone. But to your point, that will require some level of dispensation from the Commonwealth and or the federal government. Although I'm tempted by the Uber model, which is you basically go in and you just start, and eventually regulation catches up with you. So I'm wondering whether maybe that's even a way to go. If we were simply able to sign up a particular municipio in Puerto Rico and start working with them, maybe we would get to a critical mass where they would just be supportive of what we were trying to do.
Just to build a little bit off that, I think that's a really great idea. We're looking for, as it were, an entrepreneurial politician who sees this as a way to get ahead. And it could be, as long as it's transparent, there are also ways in which he and his network can make money off of it. So another point Haywood makes is that very often it's not the central oligarchs that promote free zones, it's the cousin, second cousin, the brother-in-law, somebody who has access to power but is not already in the middle of it, but who could, have influence. But the other thing is a municipality could become a shining star. And just going to an earlier question, I know a municipality that's interested in transparent governance because they want to be a star compared to all their neighbors. And so you want to find somebody like that, get behind them and support it.
And I think that what you're getting at is also when are we going to have, who is going to have the incentive to do this, and where are we going to get the right incentives? And my impression is that with the federal bureaucrats and politicians, they generally have this incentive to pursue redistribution rather than actual development. All the zone projects that you see are so-called enterprise zones that's stemming out of the federal government. One requirement there is not that you should target the most promising area, but that you should target the least promising area, that is the ones with high unemployment and so forth. So I feel like if we're taking Puerto Rico, we should look at where you actually can get development, where it can be a locomotive for growth, rather than an area like that. And I think that that's when you want to look at the local politicians, not out of their benevolence, but think about when can they have an incentive to be a shining star, to say, hey, I made this, look at me, look how great I am, look at all the great publicity that I get, because that's what they're in business for. That's their business model. And that's the kind of incentives that we have to play with. That's the rules of the game here.
Can I add on top of that to Marc's? I think Marc's idea is excellent. One reason is going back to my point about, we're not trying to have an external party impose a zone structure on Puerto Rico. Ideally, you'd want it to come up from within. And again, going back to successful SEZs, like the ones in China, Ronald Coase's last book was called Marginal Revolutions, and it talked about early transition from Chinese Communist government to its modern government. And the point he made there is it was not imposed from the outside. It was Deng Xiaoping giving small communities the rights to innovate and really it being a bottom-up thing. And I think that's essential to having sustainability.
Okay, I should allow. Yeah, let's take next question.
So very, very much related to what you're talking about right now, and it's interesting to hear that there's 78 municipalities. I saw that there is a state-level chief information officer and chief innovation officer. I wonder whether they're effective, but more importantly, are there any of those municipalities or local governments that are employing that chief innovation officer that can be the bridge between private sector lessons and government, so that those communities have the chance to be that shining star?
I think just as a general comment with respect to financial transparency, which is something that chief information officer would often be involved with. In Puerto Rico, it's very poor. The level of disclosure is very bad. It's delayed and not nearly as complete, not in machine-readable form. So I think Puerto Rico needs a lot of help with that. I'm pretty sure that that you'd find that the brain drain that has affected the private sector in Puerto Rico as professionals move out and here to get a more sustainable lifestyle has undoubtedly affected the government as well. So some of the really, bright civil servants are probably looking for the exits if they haven't already found them.
Yes.
I was going to ask you, you mentioned 78 municipalities, whatever. Is it that clean where they're separate, or do they have city, county, state?
No, there are no counties. The Commonwealth government is the equivalent of a state, and then there are 78 subdivisions that account for the entire geography of the island. There are no unincorporated areas, so that it's a clean split of 78, and that'll include islands like Vieques, for example, is a separate island. That's its own municipality.
One question over here.
So, yeah, you're right, but Commonwealth does have many of the rights that the state has. Massachusetts being a Commonwealth is. But Puerto Rico doesn't enjoy many of the rights that actually states have, whether financial or otherwise. So is the issue really systemic in that regard? It was never meant to be, a high economic zone. And what could be done in that respect? So if you're talking about the Caymans, for instance, the Caymans wasn't subject to U.S. federal regulation, especially the banking area. That was the second. So they can be a very freewheeling and do exactly what they want to do in that regard. Puerto Rico does not enjoy that luxury. And how do you address something like that?
No, I think that's a real challenge. One possible, even if Puerto Rico could say have access to Texas law or Nevada law or some, actually we've got Tom Bell who's going to present ULEX, which is kind of a version of US common law. Right now it's a civil law country, and so simply to have access to the best of common law in the US would be a big improvement relative to what they've got now. So yeah, they can't go Caymans crazy, but I think they would be much stronger for economic development if either they were best of class US.
Okay, in front.
Do you think it would be a good idea to have from within, have the people there own special economic zone and act as a cooperative?
So Mark Fraser has been doing kind of revenue share. One thing in a successful zone is real estate values go up. So Shenzhen may be the most extreme case. Shenzhen was a tiny fishing village in 1980. Now it's the world's leading manufacturing center. Estimates of property values going up 20,000% or something, so just ridiculous. But even at a much smaller level, if a group of citizens, maybe every citizen in the municipality had a percentage of the revenue share of the upside, and if you could sell that effectively, that would take a real entrepreneurial politician and a whole group of people to explain this and see how it would work. But I think there's a cool model that could be done somewhere, somehow.
Yes.
I'm just curious, is it the contention of this panel that the current quasi-state association that Puerto Rico enjoys has no advantages? In other words, if we were to do an advantage and a disadvantage column, is there any chance that the current arrangement actually has some advantages that we would do better to not make the devil's deal with the Fed to enjoy, as you were saying earlier, Texas's rights or whatnot?
So just when I'm suggesting that, it's not that we would take all of Texas law. Actually, the restatements of law, and Tom Bell is kind of built on that, is an abstract sort of generalized common law legal system. So it's not tied to federal government legislation. And in fact, it's pretty good 19th century common law. It's sort of less contaminated than a lot of legislated law. So right, we would take the advantage of common law over civil law and ideally get the best of both worlds, for sure.
I do want to touch on your question because it may connect to what I said before about how Puerto Rico became associated with the United States, which is via force. And so implicit in that is a criticism of the Commonwealth structure that currently exists. while it's disappointing that we got here that way, it's hard to see a better situation for Puerto Rico right now. So the two options are statehood and independence. With independence, Puerto Rico loses, number one, the free movement of their citizens back and forth to the mainland US and the ability to immediately get a job upon landing. Second, there are, to be very honest with you, a lot of transfers between the federal government to Puerto Rico. So the last time I looked at it, something like 25 to 30% of Puerto Rico's GDP is in the form of federal assistance, either federal intergovernmental assistance or transfer payments to people who live in Puerto Rico. So if that went away, that would be a real heavy burden on the island to replace that, as well as the ability to trade tariff-free with the United States, which would also go away if Puerto Rico became independent. So while it's unfortunate that Puerto Rico, has become a victim of U.S. colonialism, 115 or 120 years in, it's really hard to see how that gets reversed. Now, the current governing party advocates statehood. I have to say I'm not particularly a fan. A problem is that Puerto Rico right now is totally insolvent. They've not serviced their debt for the last 2 years. So if they became a state, that would contaminate the U.S. municipal bond market, and it could make it harder for other governments to borrow, because right now municipal investors say, well, Puerto Rico is different. It's not really a state. It's not really a city. So we'll sort of exclude that from our thought process. If we have an insolvent state, and we haven't had a default by a state in 80 years, I think that could potentially be very destabilizing. It would set up a potentially a very bad example for Illinois, New Jersey, and some other states that are not optimal right now in their fiscal conditions. So from a U.S. point of view, I wouldn't want to see that. Second, from just a political point of view, given the fact that Puerto Rico would likely be a blue state if it became a state, I can't imagine the current Congress granting statehood. So I think that a lot of energy is being spent domestically in Puerto Rico in debating the statehood issue. And I think it's a real diversion and a real waste of time. I think they really need to get on with working within the existing political structure that has been imposed upon them and making the best of it.
To Mark's point about transfers, the Marco Rubio proposal I mentioned earlier about wage subsidies, it would have been financed by granting Puerto Rico a waiver to convert much of existing entitlement spending into a wage subsidy. So while ideally we would get rid of dependency altogether, it could be an interim step to use waiver applications to rechannel some of that money into a way that's not propping up existing bureaucracies or paying for more public employees.
And I guess part of the question here is really, okay, so there are two levels of things going on here. One is this fiscal transfer, so you got some benefits and some costs of being Puerto Rico. The other is there is there something embedded in the status here that gives an opportunity to have some kind of more autonomy, or just the fact that you've had the Maria last year and things like that, that just gives an opportunity to just say, hey, let's just try something, even if you politicians wouldn't agree to do it in any of the U.S. states. Yeah. Because I feel like embedded in the question is really, is there, in the status, is there something here that means that's, even if it's not formal, that you have more autonomy, something that gives it more opportunity to do something a bit crazier like that? That's
where my immigration proposal comes in. So let's take advantage of the fact that Puerto Rico isn't a state, that it's primarily a Spanish-speaking territory, and that it's not, has no land border with the rest of the United States, to say, look, I know immigration restrictionists don't like the idea of people from Mexico and Central America coming into the 50 states, but what's the problem with them coming into Puerto Rico? So Puerto Rico can take advantage, if Congress would allow, Puerto Rico could take advantage of its Commonwealth status to have a separate immigration policy and use that to replenish the lost population. So I think that's one definite area where we could take advantage of that structural difference.
So I will take more questions, but I hope that you will be telling me when. 5 minutes? Okay. Yes, here in front.
I'm curious to learn. I just came back from the Growing Entrepreneurial Community Summit in Kansas City at the Federal Reserve Cafe. And it was all about inclusive entrepreneurship. My question is, how do these economic zones or startup cities, what's the model about inclusivity, and how can locals also take advantage of those opportunities?
So just to start with, I would say that having a terrible business environment harms locals the most. I think one of the terrible dysfunctions around the world is the governments will bend over backwards to give tax breaks for outsiders to invest capital, and often really illegitimately. Meanwhile, a bad business environment affects the locals day in, day out. I've known, and the Doing Business Index, by the way, is based on the experience of a local entrepreneur. So it is measured as how hard is it for an indigenous local entrepreneur to create a business. And they're the ones that are big time getting screwed. So I think I would make the case that it's precisely to help the locals that we need to create a much higher quality business environment. And then once there, we also want to nurture, say, entrepreneurial incubators and ways to invest in them. There are a whole host of other things. But the business environment itself is number one a local issue.
Any other comments on that? And my impression generally, I mean, when we're talking about any special economic zones project, usually the whole idea is you're there because you want to use the human capital that is there. If you're coming in as an investor, it's no longer about just exploiting the raw material of a country, for example. And when you're setting up a zone with particular rules that is more conducive to entrepreneurship, there's never any reason to exclude the local citizens from taking advantage of that as well. Everybody will benefit from them being part of it. So that's usually the model. So yeah, one more question here.
In late December, Congress enacted federal tax reform legislation, and in it they included a section specifically applying for qualified opportunity zones, and they mentioned or signaled Puerto Rico as part of the whole island as a qualified opportunity zone. I understand the government applied for it recently and was designated as a qualified opportunity zone. Given that Puerto Rico's economy has been highly dependent on the manufacturing sector for years, do you feel as though this qualified opportunity zones is pardon the repetitiveness, but an opportunity for the government or for the island to diversify its economy and try to get back on its feet?
I can just say really quickly my impression from that, get back to an enterprise zone model. That's very much what it is, as I understand. The one criteria is that you have high unemployment and things like that. I think that in the end, it is a way to redistribute money from the U.S. states to Puerto Rico, which if you take from one person to give to another, the second person will be better off. So yes, you can benefit from that. That's one of the laws of economics that I studied once. But I'll leave a more qualified answer to any of the other panelists.
The key benefit of the Opportunity Zones legislation is it's rule-based, so there are these criteria, right? And so it's not just an open-ended commitment, right? So if there was a growth miracle in Puerto Rico, it wouldn't just be this way. It wouldn't have these special statuses forever. And I think going back to some of the history of Puerto Rico, that special status, and you see this in many different communities, like I'm Canadian, like we have special statuses for our First Nations communities, and not drawing too close of an analogy, but when you give people open-ended distinct statuses, it does over time make people optimize to the status as opposed to overcoming the status.
I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.